you find out that the overlap in that sort of Venn diagram is this. This is, and I'll explain this image as we go along. This is an egg. This is a chicken egg that has been painted with an image of a clown, right? Initially, all we knew when we sort of started the research on this project is that clowns in both the United States and the United Kingdom have this practice of painting their faces on eggs. And they refer to this as a register of face designs, and often talk about it in sort of property-like terms. They sometimes use the word copyright, sometimes they use the word trademark, sometimes they talk in more general kind of property language. So Dave and I this summer went to England to kind of explore this fascinating world and figure out what the social norms are that govern the sort of uniqueness of clown characters, this register, and kind of how those two things are related. So we interviewed a bunch of people, interviewed people that paint these eggs. We interviewed people who themselves are featured in this egg registry, working clowns, circus clowns. And what we found, and the research here is still sort of ongoing. I just did our most recent interview with a clown last Friday. So here's what we think is going on right now. Clowns have this really strong unwritten rule that says you should not copy another clown's name, image, or act, right? And so there's this notion of uniqueness is really strongly embedded, and that maps onto other creative communities that we've studied and that others have studied as well. But the relationship of this registry to this preference for uniqueness is not quite as strong as we thought. So it's made us kind of question what the role of this sort of property registry is in this space. So we'll come back to that. But you need a little bit of background to make sense of this story. I assume most of you do not have like a deep familiarity with the history and practices of clowning. So now's your chance to understand a little bit of what's going on in this space. So clowns. The history here, it's tough to pick a place to start, right? Lots of cultures have independently created or sort of come upon this notion of the clown, right? The Romans had clowns. Native American cultures had things that we would recognize as clowns. Our focus is on American and European clowning, and one place to start telling that story is with this guy, Joseph Grimaldi. Grimaldi was born in 1778, son of a very well-known actor, was first performing on stage at like the age of 2. And by age 9, he was the primary breadwinner for his family, performing as a clown, right? Rose to real prominence and fame in London in the 1780s and 1790s, so much so that his biography was written by Charles Dickens, right? This guy was important. He was a real cultural force, and this what's referred to as whiteface makeup design that he was known for has influenced and inspired generations of clowns since. So we can kind of break down the visual appearance of clowns and actually certain aspects of their sort of personalities into a few categories. So this is an example which might look familiar. This is what's referred to as the Auguste clown, right? And the Auguste clown is a sort of childlike, foolish character. The makeup design here kind of enlarges and emphasizes certain aspects of the face, the eyes and the mouth, red cheeks, red nose, often a sort of exaggerated forehead. One thing this does, it sort of helps an audience read emotion from a distance, right? We can tell a lot about a person's mood, a person's demeanor from their eyes and from their mouth, so we exaggerate those features. And that gives you an opportunity to interact with a crowd in a meaningful way at a distance. These clowns typically dress in kind of brightly colored but rather inexpensive materials, right? They're often, getting soaked with water or, sort of abused in some fashion. The Auguste stands in contrast to the white-face clown, right? The white-face clown is this sort of stern, imperious authority figure. The eyebrows are really important here in kind of conveying this sort of look of sort of scorn or arrogance. And they often wear these conical hats that we might associate with clowns. And they dress very differently. Their costumes are very expensive, right? They're made out of silk and sequins. And they certainly don't allow anyone to, throw a pie at them or, muss up this wonderfully intricate costume. And the Auguste and the whiteface kind of work as a duo, right? The buffoon and the straight man here. There are also character clowns that might be familiar, right? The cop clown or the hobo clown. This is Emmett Kelly. He was a quite famous clown in the United States. More recently, there's this sort of kind of minimalist approach to makeup that you can see here. Some people refer to this as the sort of continental look. The lips are colored. There's a small dot on the chin, some emphasis on the eyebrows, and that's about it, right? A pretty minimal look. Another thing that might surprise you, and you probably wouldn't expect, there's something of a hierarchy going on here in the world of clowns, and this hierarchy actually matters, I think. So at the kind of low end, you have amateur clowns, right, who kind of do this on the occasional weekend, show up at a charity event or a parade. Then you have kind of event clowns, people who do, birthday parties or corporate events or, sort of school functions. They're paid, but it's not their sort of full-time profession, right? They have some other means of financial support. And then at the high end, you've got the circus clown, right? The full-time professional whose primary, if not only, source of income comes through this work, right? Now, we talked to a lot of clowns and asked a lot of questions about how they approach these ideas of uniqueness, of their visual appearance, of their names, of their performance itself. And a few things that we came away with, right? So there is this widely acknowledged, widely accepted rule against what we'll call close copying, right? Figuring out what the dividing line is between sort of inspiration and from what we might, from a legal perspective, call infringement is not an easy thing to do. But everybody says you can't just copy someone else's appearance wholesale, right? Exactly where you draw that line is a harder question. So this applies to their makeup designs, it applies to their names, it applies to their costumes, and applies to the act itself, right? Everybody we talked to was really clear on this question, right? On the flip side, though, there is a kind of wide acknowledgement that some degree of inspiration, some degree of borrowing is not only acceptable, not only embraced, but really necessary. There are only so many ways that you can take a basic set of colors and decorate a human face. So lots of people talked about, drawing inspiration from other clowns, finding, I really like this person's eyebrow, and I really like the shape they used around their mouth, and so drawing from bits and pieces from lots of sources, which is, really what almost all creativity boils down to in the end. So generally, as long as you put forth some effort to make some alterations to personalize any of these aspects, whether it's the name, whether it's the makeup, whether it is elements of the act itself, that's usually enough to keep everyone happy in this space. But there were lots and lots of examples of conflict, right? Everybody we talked to had at least one story that either happened to them personally or happened to someone that they knew, where there was some accusation of improper appropriation, right? Where someone copied something that went beyond the sort of acceptable bounds here. And so we talk to people about, what's enforcement look like in this space, right? And the story there is interesting and somewhat complicated, right? There's some sort of institutional enforcement. So there are organizations, professional organizations in this space. So in the United States, there's an organization called Clowns of America International. There's another called the World Clown Association. And in the UK, there's an organization called Clowns International. And the folks we talked to from these organizations said they play some role indirectly in trying to sort of prevent and in some cases resolve these sorts of disputes. Sometimes you see professional actors step in and deal with disputes, right? So the promoters who own circuses don't want to have a reputation for allowing performers who are stealing from other folks, and they'll intervene and prevent some of these instances of copying. And then sometimes it comes down to the individual, right? The threat of violence is there below the surface, sometimes not very far below the surface. All the clowns that we talk to seem like incredibly kind, open, warm people. They love to entertain. They are really committed to sort of bringing smiles to people's faces. On the other hand, right, like many of us, when crossed, they respond in a sort of natural human way, right? And so there are arguments, right? There are hard words was sort of my favorite way of putting this, and occasionally the threat of some sort of physical altercation, right? So far, that's all consistent with a whole range of creators that folks have studied over the last decade or so in this space. What I think makes this story unique and interesting in a different way is layering on top of this set of norms this elaborate and costly registration system that exists, right? And the puzzle we're trying to figure out is why this system was created and how it has managed to persist as long as it has. So the story here goes back quite a ways to 1946 when this egg registry was first created. So pictured here you see a gentleman named Stan Bolt. Stan Bolt was not a clown. He was actually a chemist. But had a real fascination and interest in clowns. Started an organization called the Circus Clowns Club, which eventually grew into the group Clowns International that's still around today. And he started on his own painting these eggs in, as I said, 1946, and continued until his death in 1967. Why eggs? Who knows? No one can answer that question. They're available. They have a roughly human head sort of shape to them. They start off as white, and so when you're painting the white-faced clowns, at least, a lot of the work is already done for you, right? You just have to sort of add the embellishments. And so you can see here, Stan Bolt hard at work creating some eggs. Fascination with and publicity for the clown eggs goes almost all the way back to Bolt's creation. So this is a full-page color photo spread taken from the London News in 1956. And every decade, if you go through the archives that the Clowns International maintains of all of this press material, every decade you can find at least one or two big news stories in newspapers or magazines, and every one of them writes as though they are discovering this thing for the first time, right? But if you go back, so there's this story from 1956. There's another one from 1963. There's one from the 70s. There's a couple in the 80s. They're in the 90s. Until in the last couple of years, there have been some big stories written on this phenomenon by various websites. And they all sort of make it out as though they're finding this out for the first time, which I find really fascinating, right? The folks at Clowns International have just been kind of doing this, consistently for all these years. So, as you might imagine, eggs are fragile, not the most durable medium of expression, and so Bolt had about 340 eggs in his collection, and the majority of them were destroyed in the mid-1960s. There, I think, are roughly 80 of these original eggs still in existence. Half are displayed in a museum that I'll talk about in a couple minutes, and the other half are in the hands of a private collector.
Happened to the rest of them?
There was a sort of conflicting stories, but the most common story that we've heard was they were on display. He would take them around to various locations, and in the loading and unloading process, there was an accident, and they were smashed. Right. One of the dangers of working in this medium. So they've actually moved from using real chicken eggs to now they use ceramic brooding eggs, right? So these things that are considerably sturdier. And so the practice has continued. There have been 3 other artists who've painted these eggs over the decades, Janet Webb, Kate Stone, and Debbie Smith. Once you've seen enough of these, you can actually identify who painted them based on their style. They're quite distinct. These are mostly Kate Stone's work right here. Debbie's the current egg artist. Dave and I traveled to the sort of quaint seaside town of Folkestone, where we interviewed her in her studio about why she does this, about what the process looks like, and it's pretty fascinating. So. Here you can see some of these eggs in process. So the folks who get their eggs painted and added to the clown egg register are all members of this organization, Clowns International, right? So you sign up for a Clowns International membership, which involves some degree, a perhaps inconsistent degree, a fairly low degree of sort of screening for professional competence, for name uniqueness, for, are you actually a working clown? And when you sign up for your membership, you are able to sort of redeem this voucher for having an egg painted. And one of the interesting things here is that Clowns International encourages its members to wait until they've really finalized a look. Clowns kind of evolve their visual appearance over years. They experiment. They find out new things that work and don't work. And so before your face is enshrined in the egg registry, they want to make sure that you sort of settled on something that's at least approaching kind of your final look here. So once that happens, you send in a photograph, you send in some samples of your costume, right? So you can see it's not just the face itself, but they try to recreate the overall visual appearance of the clown by incorporating these elements from the costume as well. And Debbie paints these. It takes her about 3 days of work, and she's paid an entire £16 for her trouble. Right, this is not a labor of love. This is not a money making scheme on her part. Now, I mentioned the eggs are on display, right? And they're on display in one of the strangest places I've ever spent time in my life. It is this rural tourist trap called Wookie Hole near Somerset. And it's a fascinating place. It's a set of caverns, limestone caverns, partially natural, partially man-made, and a whole bunch of bizarre attractions, right? So they have a list of like all of the weird things they have there. They have life-size dinosaur sculptures. They have a elaborate miniature golf setup. The place is so bizarre that the clown eggs are like the 25th weirdest thing that's going on in this location. It is like truly fascinating place. But you go there, and they have a section of the attraction that's dedicated to the circus and to clowns. In fact, the Wookie Hole is actually owned by a well-known circus owner in the UK. And you can go and see these eggs, right? And so each egg has a tiny sort of placard that includes the name of the clown. This is the sort of public face of this registration system. There's also sort of a private record here, too, that's maintained by Clowns International, where they have this written document, this book that has not only the clown name of the performer, but also their legal name. It has their registration number, as well as the date at which they joined Clowns International, which creates this sort of record of priority in a sense, right? So we know when these clowns joined the organization. We know when their eggs were painted. Now, Dave and I wondered, is all this sort of property talk, this idea that we're creating a sort of a system to establish a kind of informal copyright, was that just sort of a kind of post hoc rationalization for all of this behavior, which just started out as like some weird chemist's hobby? Or was this part of the story from the beginning? And we've found what I think is the best proof so far to help us answer that question, and that is this video, which I want to take a minute to show you, and hopefully we'll have the audio here. It's kind of crucial to this bit of the story.
The simple warmth of clowns, so much a part of every circus, all alike, but are they so alike? For every clown has his own working face.
This video is from the mid-1950s, about a decade.
To safeguard the unwritten law that clowns do not copy each other's makeup design, Mr. Stan Bolt, secretary of the International Circus Clown Club, uses painted eggshells to build up a register of faces. Putting the finishing touches to the eggshell replica of Michael Gerbola's face, better known as Clown Tony of Bertram Mills Circus, Mr. Bolt adds another record to his library.
So we have talk about this uniqueness norm. We have talk about building a registry of faces, right? Like from the very beginning, or very close to the beginning. This is a clown named Coco, who is an incredibly well-known clown at the time, sitting down there. From the very early stages, this was conceptualized and marketed as a kind of quasi-legal record of property interests, right? That, to me, is fascinating, right? This is a story from Mechanics Illustrated in April of 1957, which, if you read the text here, so the faces he paints, referring to Bolt, on the eggs are authentic copies of those belonging to the members of the International Circus Clowns Club. As secretary of the European division of the club, Bolt keeps a file of faces so that clowns can avoid copying each other. Each clown's makeup is his professional, jealously guarded property. Right? So again, like we see that at least the people who are creating this collection see it as serving that function, right? But I think the property story is actually more complicated than that. When you talk to the clowns themselves, this is a well-known circus clown named Bippo, who we interviewed in an otherwise empty, just the three of us, 500-seat circus tent, which was just like a fascinating way to spend an afternoon. They tell us that, well, yeah, so Bippo's got his face painted on an egg. I think actually two, one from when he was a very young child. He was like the youngest clown in Britain for a time, and another with his sort of older, kind of more developed persona. He says, well, look, people don't really consult this thing. People don't go look at the eggs before they decide on a face. They're not consciously trying to avoid these existing property interests. And it's not all that common that it's actually used to help resolve a dispute. If two clowns have a disagreement, it's not like one of them says, we're gonna get in the car and we're gonna drive from London 3 hours down these one-lane, incredibly terrifying rural roads to get to Wookiee Hole, so we can go. I can point out my egg and prove that I'm in the right. So it's conceptualized as playing this sort of property register function, but in practice, it's not clear that it actually does any of that work. If that's the case, why do they do this? Why do they spend the amount of time and effort involved in making these sorts of creations? So Dave and I have been trying to think about what those explanations might be. So, part of it is we're not denying the property function, but we just don't think it's the primary driver of what's going on here. And so maybe there are some kind of non-property, non-legal functions that this registration system serves that might be valuable and that might actually tell us something about the IP system. So, it's creating this sort of historical record. People are interested in kind of preserving this art form for the sake of posterity. It's a way of taking a disorganized group of performers and imposing some sort of systematization, some sort of order on exactly what they're doing. There's some sense of prestige by being included there's a kind of signaling function going on here. I'm a professional. I'm not some amateur. I belong to this group. And by kind of holding out those promises to their members, this is a way for Clowns International to bring people within their organization, which then enables them to engage in education, enables them to sort of teach people up to the kind of professional standards that they want to see kind of define the role of the clown. And I think this sort of signaling function is a really interesting one here, because I think you can see some parallels in the formal legal system as well. So, if you talk to people, talk to small business owners, why do you want to register your trademark? They might have some answers that that are about the benefits of trademark registration from a legal perspective, but sometimes people are interested in having some sort of document that communicates to the world that, like, this isn't a hobby. This is a real thing. I'm committed to this business. There's a literature out there about the signaling function of patents, right? That one thing that a patent does is send a signal to, among other people, potential venture backers, right, that we're a serious company. We have technology that is valuable. We're not getting these patents necessarily because we're going to use them defensively or offensively, but they send a signal to the world about the quality of what we do here. And I think something really similar is going on when it comes to clowns in this space. I've got just one more slide I want to show you here. So this egg registry in the UK is not the only time clowns have made an effort at this same sort of practice. There's also an egg registry in the United States that's currently privately held. It's not on display anywhere in Virginia. But there's also this thing. This is the National Clown and Character Registry, which has been around for decades. It's been defunct since the early 2000s, but there's some chance that it's going to be revived here. And they issued, as you can see from the picture, official, not just clown identification cards. Let's get it straight. Official clown identification cards, right? And the clowns who submitted their photographs got one of these cards for themselves, right, to keep, and a copy was kept in this register. And there are a bunch of things that motivated the creation here, but one of the similarities with the UK Clown Egg Registry is this idea that it creates a record of your face, of your makeup design and your name, which could then, at least in theory, be used to settle some dispute over priority with another clown, right? So I think this sense of legitimacy, this sense of belonging that comes from being in one of these official registries is an important piece of this puzzle, right? And it might suggest that other kinds of creators are likewise motivated not just about kind of economic considerations, but this sense of recognition and belonging and kind of signaling their value to both the outside world and members of their own community. So I think if those, in fact, are powerful motivators here that lead people to go to these sorts of lengths, then that's something that the IP system should probably account for. I could talk about this all day, but I want to hear from all of you. You have to have questions after seeing the information that we've collected here. So I'm happy to hear your comments or suggestions or questions.
I have a dumb question.
We've got a microphone coming your way.
All the way across. I'm wondering, this whole time you're giving us these eggs, how are they preserved? Are they hard boiled? Or what? And you know it's a dumb question, but I mean,
no,
it's
not.
been bothering me.
Yeah, so the eggs, they sort of blew out the contents of the eggs, right? So they poke a little hole in the egg, blow out the internal components of the egg, and so then you're left with just the shell. But the shells are incredibly fragile, right? This is why the old eggs did not hold up very well. Even some of the eggs that are in the museum have cracked and sort of collapsed just kind of under their own weight over the years. So this is why they've moved to these brooding eggs, much more durable. The American egg registry, I haven't seen it. From what I've heard, we're American, so of course everything has to be like bigger and better. They use goose eggs, which right, yeah. We're just going to get like bigger and bigger animal eggs to solve this problem. So, yeah.
Do they have pictures of all the ones that were destroyed?
They do not. Not in any sort of systematic way. One thing they've done to try to deal with the eggs that have been lost over the years is to recreate them. So the sort of more recent artists have used photographs to go back and recreate eggs that they know were in the collection originally but have been destroyed over time. So Dave and I were lucky enough in the course of our interviews to see. I mentioned there's 40 of the old eggs on display in Wookey Hole. One of the folks that we interviewed is the person who sort of found and obtained at significant expense these other 40 eggs that were thought lost for decades. And so we got to see them. I think we're two of a really small handful of people who know that those eggs are out there and have actually had the opportunity to see them and photograph some of those. So, I mean, this is another one of the really fascinating pieces of this story, right? There's a lot of kind of incongruity here. The idea that you want to keep, you're trying to create a sort of official record, and an official record that's going to last and that serves this sort of archival function, but you chose to do it using this medium that, like, of course this didn't work, right? So I find that just completely fascinating, that this was the medium that was selected.
Did the clowns say whether the norm against close copying applies to clowns who have passed away or unequivocally said they're leaving the business?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and it's something that came up in our conversations more than once, right? So there are instances where clowns have adopted like the name or kind of persona of a deceased clown. So there's a story about Emmett Kelly, right, the sort of well-known hobo clown, and late in his life, I think he was in his 70s, but was very quick to tell you that he could still perform anytime he wanted, right? Still had all of his skills. His son, Emmett Kelly Jr., started performing under the Weary Willie clown persona, like really similar makeup, same name. And at least according to what we've read, this led to years of estrangement between the father and son, right? He was so upset that his son had taken on this persona that they just didn't speak for years. There have been other instances where, especially within families, there is a sense in which the clown persona is descendable, right? In which you can kind of pass it on to someone else. But it seems like, from what we've heard, that's kind of at the discretion of the original clown, right? So the norm does not go so far as to say, even with permission, you're not able to duplicate someone else's persona. But you know, which is kind of consistent with the idea that they think of this in kind of property terms, right? That it's up to the individual owner to make those choices. But we've heard stories going in both directions.
What are the properties of the paint that are used on the eggs? Is it an oil? Is it water? Is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The original eggs were actually done not in paint, but essentially in crayon, which I think has meant they've faded considerably over time. I think they use acrylic paint now. I think that's right.
So my first question was, have you encountered analogous phenomena in other creative endeavors? But then the question I reached after that is sort of more interesting to me. You mentioned graffiti as being another form of art that you've considered, and with graffiti being illegal, what are the sort of, is there a comparable community building? I mean, I've read about sort of communities and attention to graffiti art, but the fact that it's illegal, how does that impact how they are protecting their creative product?
Yeah, the graffiti example is really fascinating. So the book that I mentioned earlier is a great chapter in the book, not written by me, but by a UK academic who wrote her PhD actually after spending kind of years embedded in the London graffiti scene. So her knowledge of that world is really remarkable. part of what's going on there is, of course, like the visual designs that are created by graffiti writers, meet the basic requirements for copyright protection, right? They're original, they're fixed, but there is this sort of practical hurdle to enforcement, which is you've usually, not always, but you've usually committed a crime in the creation of that work, right? I don't think that stands as any real obstacle to copyright protection per se. All sorts of illegal works are protected by copyright, right, including things that are obscene. But in the course of the enforcement, right, you've got to admit that you created this thing, and then maybe at that point the police or the property owner is now in a better position. I think that's part of what's going on. The other thing that's going on is, graffiti writers, for the most part, they're not making money off of this work, right? There's not a kind of financial interest at stake, and not sufficient revenue from the work to justify the cost of relying on the legal system, right? So for a lot of these creators, it's just as much a question of the costs of litigation and the cost of hiring a lawyer, even short of litigation, that sort of steer them away from the formal legal system and into these kind of norm-based approaches. And that's true actually for lots of creators in what we would think of as kind of traditional creative spaces, right? Lots of musicians have disagreements and disputes with each other, but only the ones who can afford to pay a lawyer are engaged in litigation. The rest of them find other ways to resolve disputes.
Are there these informal communities that have found other ways of enforcing their integrity-based proscription against copying each other?
Yeah. I think you see this in a whole range of creative spaces, right? What I think is interesting about the ones that we've tended to highlight in our research is that they rely almost exclusively on the informal system, right? When it comes to, screenwriters or poets or musicians or photographers, there's I think a healthy mix of all sorts of kind of strategies for dispute resolution, right? We think of litigation, perhaps, right? As lawyers, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But there are kind of a host of interventions that sort of fall short of that, often which resemble these kinds of norm-based enforcement systems. What makes these cases, I think, special is there's almost no formal legal enforcement whatsoever, and it's not even the threat of formal legal enforcement that gets people to act. It's about sort of community-based sanctions. It's about shaming. It's about reputation. It might be about sort of exclusion and sort of blacklisting at kind of at the extremes. But you see this phenomenon kind of play out in a way that I think is interesting, because going back to that sort of public good story that I talked about at the beginning, if it's the case that these sorts of communities can manage to solve all of their problems without the intervention of kind of legal exclusivity, then I think we have to think long and hard about exactly what work we think the IP system is doing and for who. That's not to say that these systems are like a complete replacement for legally backed exclusive rights, but only that the kind of backdrop against which those rights are being created and enforced is just much more complicated. And so I think we need to think about these questions in a way that takes the experiences and practices of these communities into account, and especially for groups like the ones that we've been writing about and talking about. They're not part of the conversation, right? The clowns don't have a lobbyist that's knocking on Chairman Goodlot's door about copyright reform or something along those lines, right? So I hope that answered your question. Okay.
How'd you find clowns? I mean, did you wake up one morning and looked in the mirror, thought you looked kind of nice?
Since I started writing about these sorts of issues, I'm sort of constantly on the lookout for examples that sort of fall into this space. And I read probably, it's 2 or 3 years ago now, read an article that was sort of summarizing this, what seemed to me at the time, this bizarre fight between two clowns on a message board about one of them copying the other's makeup. And that just sort of caught my eye and seemed so interesting and so unexpected. And then that kind of led down the path to discovering the egg registry itself. And then at that point, I was like, well, there's just no getting out of this now. This is what I'm going to spend a year of my professional life on. Are we out of time? Well, thank you all so much. I'm happy to stick around if people want to chat more.